Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of the Influence Continuum. And I'm delighted to invite Philip Goldberg to be my guest this week. Philip has been studying the world's spiritual traditions for more than 50 years as a practitioner, teacher, and author. He's an ordained interfaith minister, spiritual counselor, public speaker. He's presented at major venues throughout the United States and has been featured in numerous publications. He's authored and co-authored more than 25 books, including Get Out of Your Own Way, The Intuitive Edge, Road Signs on the Spiritual Path, American Veda, From Emerson and the Beatles to Yoga and Meditation, How Indian Spirituality Changed the West, the seminal biography of the life of Yogananda, the story of the yogi who became the first modern guru, and his most recent book, Spiritual Practice for Crazy Times, Powerful Tools to Cultivate Clarity, Calm, and Courage, which I purchased. And here's their plug. And Philip has taught courses on various online platforms, hosts his own podcast, which we will add a link to, and very interestingly, and a big motivation for me is that he serves on the board of a new entity called the Association for Spiritual Integrity. Philip, I was introduced to you by Rachel Harris, who I was recommended to interview for this podcast on her latest book on psychedelic wisdom. She's a PhD, a very interesting person, and she told me about you, and I looked at video of your presentation and others at the Harvard Divinity School meeting. And I am fascinated to know more about the Association for Spiritual Integrity and your desire with other practitioners to kind of set standards of practice and honor codes for ethical behavior. Because, as you know from my background, I got harmed thinking I was on a legitimate spiritual path with a Korean messianic figure. Little did I know it was a destructive authoritarian political cult with religious, veneer. And I think you know a little bit of my story, that I was in it. I was promoted to leadership. Then I fell asleep at the wheel of a van and led to a voluntary deprogramming where I learned about Chinese communist brainwashing, and I came to the realization Moon wasn't the greatest spiritual teacher in human history, that Buddha and Jesus and Mohammed didn't bow to him in the spirit world, saying how honored they are to serve him, all this other BS that I was told as a Moonie. In any case, Philip, we're living in very crazy times.
Yes.
And there's so much confusion, so much, overload, especially through the internet and smartphones. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to cross-fertilize your experiences and mine, and hopefully share some interesting insights and directions for our audience.
It's great to be with you, Steve, and I thank Rachel, my old friend, for introducing us. I interviewed her for my podcast as well, and I should point out to your listeners that I'll be interviewing you for my podcast.
Okay, that's great. And you may get a little blowback from people who don't like me, whether it's because I'm criticizing their former guru or whatever, but that's part of the path that we both choose to take.
The cross you have to bear.
Even as a Jew, a good Jew, bearing that cross. So, Philip, let's start, if we may, with the Association for Spiritual Integrity and what its agenda is and what your hopes are with this entity.
Well, it was started a few years ago by friends of mine a friend of mine and other spiritual teachers who have become friends of mine. And at a certain point, I was asked to help out, and I found what they were doing important. And so I became a board member at one point. And it was started for much the same reasons you began your enterprises. As you pointed out in the intro, I've been around what Harvard Divinity School is calling alternative spiritualities for many decades. And I researched a lot of them in American Veda because I covered the whole history of all the teachers who came here from India, and discovered along the way there were many. There was much abuse of power and much corruption. That we all thought and hoped would go away when books like American Veda and magazine articles and conferences and psychological studies and all kinds of things came out of those events of the 60s and 70s. But sad to say, it did not go away. And the parade of misbehaving spiritual teachers continued in different ways, in different places. And it was very disconcerting.
Sure.
And so my friends started ASI, Association for Spiritual Integrity, to remind people that ethics matter and moral behavior matters, and they matter especially when they're done in the name of, when they're not upheld by people who hold themselves to spiritual principles and values and present themselves as teachers. And so the idea was first to come up with a code of ethics, which we did. We call it the code of, I forget the...
There's an honor code for individuals and for organizations, which I think is very smart.
Yeah, the organizational part was a later realization after we had the individual part. Because as we all... the first order of focus was this world of independent spiritual teachers who kept, many of whom were misbehaving. And we realized that, is especially vulnerable, an especially vulnerable area because there's no organization to hold people accountable, no standards being taught, no systems for accountability and so forth. Not that organizations always do a bang-up job, as we know, and they often compound the problem. But at least when they're populated by well-meaning people, there's systems in place and standards to be upheld, just as there are misbehaving physicians and psychologists, but there are reputable associations that can hold people accountable. So we thought something like that would be necessary, but we didn't have the means or the inclination or the talent to be an investigative organization or a legal one or a punitive one.
Yeah, you can't issue you're out of the club because you're misbehaving.
It's not like there are licenses that you can retract or something. But we felt at least to educate both students of spiritual seekers and teachers that ethics matter,
Mm-hmm.
and to sort of poke the bubble of the assumption in many spiritual circles that if you attain a certain level of spiritual experience or purport to, that proper ethical and moral behavior naturally follow.
Right.
And the accompanying bubble that teachers with some spiritual stature and influence are somehow above the normal standards of right and wrong,
Right.
which is a very easy principle to weaponize
Yes.
and has been many times. And so we took on that educational role, and the idea was to get, for the most part, independent spiritual teachers to sign on and say, yes, ethics matter. I pledge to uphold the principles that ASI has on its site or the equivalent that of my own. And here's what it is.
Right.
That was the point. Then we realized we could have organizational members, and that requires some tweaking of
Yes.
the code, and that's what it is. And subsequently, other needs keep popping up that we're not equipped to handle, like enforcement.
Right.
And but we started to have mechanisms in place so that if a person's a member of ASI and a student comes forth and says, I have a problem with this teacher, we can at least arrange for mediation, conversation, and so forth. So we started to put that in place. And the other thing was we realized that a lot of teachers would benefit very much from, or teachers in general would benefit very much, regardless of whether they're a part of a reputable or traditional organization or operating independently, from having peer support, from having other teachers to talk to,
Yeah.
to help them in situations where, and to help them identify their own shadow stuff and the things they're struggling with. Many, even in large institutions,
Yeah.
Catholic Church, whatever, often the spiritual teachers, the clerics, the ministers, or whoever, whatever their title, they don't have peers they can be open and speak to in confidence, because of the pressures and so forth. And so we instituted a pilot study to come up with ways of doing that. And we're doing some public outreach, which is why you heard of us being at the Harvard conference. And we'll be at the Parliament of World Religions coming
Yeah, and
up
why
in
I
August.
wanted to do this to let people know about it, because I hear as a therapist from mostly the people who've been traumatized, people who've been religiously and spiritually harmed. I've had people, including myself, express I feel like I was spiritually raped.
Yeah.
My trust in the divine, my trust in God was, devastated. Even though I was praying several hours a day and my life was really in service to others, I didn't, I was told the self was evil, so I was doing everything for what I thought was the vision, but I didn't have any checks and balances or checklists of what kinds of things to look for. So I'm very, very supportive of this effort. And
Thank you.
I want to note that you just had a speaker there who is an attorney, Carol Murchison, who
Yes.
I recently met at a cult conference, the
Oh, yes.
International.
And I'm happy to have played a role in your connecting with her.
Yeah, exactly. And so I got to meet her, and she is a very feisty attorney who really doesn't hesitate to stand up to power, even if it's wealthy power or threatening power, to say you harmed people and you need to stop harming people and you need to be held legally accountable. So she
Yeah.
has representing some victims of Michael Shoemaker out in Oregon. And so I haven't yet heard her talk for you. I think it's been recorded.
It's
People
been
might.
recorded, and it could be, I don't know if it's on YouTube yet or on our website, but it will be soon.
Right. But I'll just add that, I went back and did my doctoral work just a few years ago in my 60s. And I wanted to create a formula for the legal system to have reliable ways to understand brainwashing and thought reform and coercive persuasion, coercive control, and connect it to what is illegal, which is trafficking, labor trafficking, or sex trafficking, which is for fraud, force, or coercion. Certainly fraud and coercion is what I deal with all the time. Sometimes there's force. And I did the first quantitative study on any model, which is my BITE model of authoritarian control. So my hope is to take undue influence, which is a 300-year-old legal concept from British common law, Philip, but it's about property, like somebody taking over someone's mind so they give the property to them instead of their rightful heirs. I wanted to update it to include our minds and our bodies and our time. And I think it would create a framework legally where organizations, if they're, for example, using deceptive recruitment and saying, we're not a religion, but come, and then the next thing they're bowing to an altar, like I was 2 weeks later. That was literally my experience, that group should lose their tax exemption status and, might be held accountable. So, all of those things need to happen, in my opinion, especially in this digital age with AI, and people are addicted to their platforms and their minds are getting mush, in my opinion, and we're losing discernment, Philip, and that's something that I know is dear to your heart and mine.
It is. Yes.
As someone of spirit, someone who believes there's more to life than making money or being famous, but actually cultivating your consciousness, your soul, and helping others and practicing love. So talk a little bit more about what you've learned over the decades.
Well, I was drawn to the teachings of the East. I don't want to get too autobiographical, but I was a child of the 60s and I was a seeker. I was raised by secular people whose idea of religion was the opiate of the people model.
Marxism.
Yeah. And so I had no interest or exposure really to religion, but I was a seeker. Once the 60s happened, I was part of the counterculture, and I discovered the teachings of the East. And one of the reasons I was drawn to them was they were presented in a very empirical way, not faith-based, not you have to believe this or you'll go to hell, but here are some ideas and principles, test them out for yourself, see if they hold up to your experience and reason. And more important to me was, here are methods, principally in those days, for me, meditation and the yogic repertoire of practices. Try them, see if they work, and if they work, keep doing them and see if it holds up. And they did, and for me, and so I dove in. And my choice at the time was transcendental meditation, which had become worldwide
Yeah, it
sort
was
of
famous because of the
globally
Beatles,
because
right?
of the Beatles in
Right.
1968, which was around, I was a product of that era. And I took to it. It transformed my life for the better. I won't go into what a mess it was before. And I decided I would become a teacher of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I did that for a few years and worked for that organization and held up the founder, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, as a great teacher. Um, I could never quite uh, adhere to a level of devotion or uh, reverence and worship that other people did. And I thought I was spiritually deficient at the time. I thought I'm having trouble shaking my street corner Brooklyn cynicism.
Oh,
But it
Brooklyn on
probably,
Queens, by the way.
I later realized it saved me
Yeah.
because I retained, a certain degree of skepticism and
So you didn't believe that you could levitate and float across a
I
room
took
or
those courses, but
be invisible, walk through walls?
never never believed those. Well, I shouldn't say I never believed they were possible. I never believed they were possible for the likes of me
Ah,
and the ordinary people trying to do them. Whether were possible to, ascetics living in the purity of the Himalayas at some earlier time of history, I I remained open to that possibility, but I did not expect to see
mm,
people floating across the room or disappearing
yeah,
or doing any of those things. It was presented to us as that the main reason for doing it was about the expansion of consciousness, and I found that to have some merit. But the when those practices were announced, sometime toward the late 70s, they were presented publicly in a way I just couldn't, feel comfortable with. And like a lot of other people, I
right,
said, I'm. This is a this is a sign to
right.
pull away
Yeah.
from that. And it was one of many. But
If I may jump in,
yeah,
Philip, and
please,
just
yeah,
say, I got out of the Moonies and I hadn't really been in any other, intensive, guru oriented or leader oriented group, but I made friends with people like Patrick Ryan, who was in it and went to MIU, Michael Downey, Gina Catania, who was a child whose parents are one of the first disciples of Maharishi. Later, I was on a panel with Judith Bork, who wrote a book about having
I know
sex
Judith well.
with Maharishi, and the Mantric Fraud and Herb Benson and just so much. So
I
I'm
was one of Herbert Benson's subjects in his
ah,
first study.
yep. And then he wrote the relaxation response.
Yeah.
The bottom line, what I want to say now is just like life is a journey, and we do the best that we can with the information and experiences that we have. And there's room to grow and go, you know what? I thought that was really something better or different than what my experience has told me. And I'll just comment on what you just said, and that is that there's this pattern in abusive groups of blaming the victim or
Yeah.
saying the group is perfect, the leader's perfect, you have bad karma, you have a dark soul, you aren't concentrating hard enough,
You
and
don't get it.
you don't get it. And this shame and guilt
Yeah.
thing where you just keep working harder and harder, but you can never get it because the leader was never enlightened in the first place, and the system itself was tragically flawed because it was about power, money, and sex, and abuse of sex, often of followers. So,
At
but
the same time, as you know,
yeah,
because you've, to one degree or another, I mean, When I was researching American Veda, I'd known about a lot of uh, abuses of power because I've been around a long time.
Hmm.
But then I found out more
Right.
and different ones. But I interviewed people who had been in those organizations that had been followers of those people.
Hmm.
And one of the most interesting things was I looked at certain of those teachers as the most egregious abusers. Um, but even their followers, for the most part, would say, yeah, but he changed my life for the better.
Oh,
And
yeah.
and what I learned that was of value, some people throw the babies out with the bathwater, and other people can separate and discern
Right.
what's useful, what's can be taken away and applied. That's of value, and what needs to be discarded, and what needs to be discarded within themselves as well,
Yep.
and so forth. So
So,
that's an interesting piece of the puzzle.
yeah, absolutely. And as a therapist, I don't want people to throw the baby out with the bathwater if they've had positive
Right.
experiences and insights. I mean, for me, I could say I learned how to public speak in the Moonies because I was a shy person. I had never lived communally other than at summer camp with a few other boys. I didn't live with people from all over the world in a house. I
Or as an
never
adult.
fasted beyond Yom Kippur for one day. I fasted for 7 days with just water, working full days in the cult. Um, I I I had a lot of experiences. I learned how to run a business to make a lot of money for the Moonies too, selling flowers and candles.
Uh,
But I also just want to say that there are people who have tragic backgrounds and they're like drug addicted or they're suicidal, and then they meet the cult and their life gets
yeah.
better and they have hope. Great. For me, I wasn't that. But in the process of indoctrination and brainwashing, this is another common pattern, Philip, with the groups that I deal with, and that is the uh, the confabulating of memory of who you were before
Hmm.
to the dark side. So if you talk to me right after I got out of the Moonies, I'd be like, I was miserable as a child. I was a drug addict. I had smoked a few joints. You know, my father was abusive. It turned out when my sister challenged me, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Well, Dad hit me." And she said, "Huh? Dad never hit us." And I'm like, "Yes, I remember. I was 13 and he slapped my cheek when I lied to him." And she said, "Oh, so he lost his temper one time? Give me another example." And I was like, but I really believed that I
Oh
had had
boy.
a horrible
Wow.
life and literally needed videos and friends and people to like remind me. I had a
Wow.
really blessed childhood, and
Yeah. Yeah.
my parents were married and no gambling, smoking, drinking affairs, alcoholism, nothing. It was like boringly, Queens, mom was an art teacher, dad had a hardware business. In any case, um, but I definitely want to encourage people to not be in a binary of all or nothing.
For
uh,
sure.
I got burned, therefore I can't do any spiritual practice or trust anyone ever
Right.
again, but
Right.
rather teach them tools for discernment of checking out a source for information and is there legitimacy. And there's so many people now who are like, I'm a prophet of God and I get revelations, like this whole new apostolic reformation movement with 40 million Americans of the Christian ilk, pseudo Christian, or the Frederick Lenzes, who was in Sri Shimnoi, but he decided that he was enlightened in the continent of Atlantis in a past life and right. And
Oh, yes.
how do you judge when someone says I was an enlightened master in a past life?
Or they are now.
Right. Right. So, but coming back to behaviors, and are they honest, and do they practice what they preach? Are they saying
Yeah.
renounce the ego, but they're all about their face on every book, and, bow to my feet and kiss that and bring me fruit and such.
And there are telltale signs. And to me, one was always, are you being asked to pull away from your family? Are you being asked to isolate yourself just in the group, in the cult? Are you allowed to ask challenging questions, or are you ostracized if you do? So there are, as I don't have to tell you,
No, but
there
we are
are
telling my listeners. I want
I
them
mean,
to hear you, because you walk the walk, and we're elders, so we want to
oh,
pass it
thanks for
on.
reminding me, Steve.
Sorry, but we are.
We
I'm
are. No,
69. I think you got maybe a year
by
on
a
me.
few years, yeah.
But
But no, you're right, and we've learned a lot. And
yeah,
what I meant when I said I don't have to tell you was I was about to say there are degrees of egregiousness,
yeah,
and most of the organizations, at least the ones I'm familiar with, um, there are levels of participation available, so that it doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing.
mm,
There's just that most organizations have an inner circle, an
yeah,
inner core, a nucleus, and then there's orbits around
yep.
that nucleus, and
Yeah, I'm
it's
going to
in the
hold up a graphic, Philip, of one of my charts.
there you go.
Most people are what I call fringe members. They have no
That's right.
clue what people are, what's happening here or here or here.
But uh, they see people who are in the inner circle because they're the face of the
Right?
organization, they're the authority figures, and so forth. And they often then aspire to be part of the inner circle.
Yeah.
And that aspiration can lead to some people, to many people. I saw it,
Right.
trying to be something they're not, and not being true to themselves so they can find their way in. It's not too different. It's because it's a spiritual context. It is very different, but it's not that different from trying to climb the ladder and get a series of promotions in a company or
I
something.
think you hit something that I think is really important, which is that we have these traditions from another culture, another country, coming to the US, and this consumer, competitive thing. And how can it not, become money, power, greed, 92 Rolls Royces in one location for Rajneesh. So
And for
Osho.
the followers, it's not necessary. They don't necessarily aspire to positions of prominence in a spiritual organization because they want to be rich. They may have given up on wealth as a motivation, but they want the prestige and they want the spiritual wealth. They think, by becoming a member of the inner circle, there are spiritual benefits to be
Right.
gained. And then often when they get into the inner circle, even if they get in, with 1 foot in the door, sometimes they see stuff that's very unappealing.
Yep.
And they're smart enough to say, not for me.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
sometimes it works out to their detriment.
Yeah, and I want to just mention a friend of mine and colleague, Daniel Shaw, who spent 17 years in Siddha Yoga, Muktananda and Guru Mai. He was in the inner circle, and he's gone on to become a licensed therapist, and he's written books on traumatic narcissism, which I think is a really important concept to warn spiritual seekers about, to learn that the guru is like vampiring off their members because of their own insecurities, their own
Mm.
lack of healthy sense of self. And who is the person? I think you cited it in something that I read or something I heard you say where the leader said something like, you need to have a self to renounce it.
Yeah, something like that. Do you have it?
You have
And
to
there's
grow
something
up first
you
before
have,
you then
right.
go, there's
But you,
more.
you need an ego before you can,
Right,
get beyond your ego.
right.
But there is that. Uh, I wonder if that term, what did you call it? What narcissism?
He calls it traumatic
Traumatic
narcissism
narcissism.
because it's so painful to the followers and they can never do enough. But it's
Yeah.
all about feeding the cult leader as opposed to really nurturing them as students.
Is there such a thing as the members, the students, having traumatic narcissism?
Of course.
Yeah.
But it's absolutely no. There are definitely personality disorders, and as a mental health professional, the latest theories are about attachment disorders in the first few years of life. But there's some profoundly unbalanced people who really need therapy and not spiritual ashram.
Yeah.
They really need to. And I listened to Connie Zweig's presentation on the shadow self, which makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
I've read Jung and understand it's an important concept to
Yes.
realize that we have this self-image and we suppress the other darker elements of our sense of self, but the healthiest thing is to shine a light on it, not to pretend it doesn't exist at all.
Absolutely. And one of the more the symptoms of being in a cult-like situation is you're discouraged from doing that.
Right.
It's not considered spiritually healthy
Right.
to examine such things. But and one of the pieces I've found, and I think I fell prey to this myself back in the day, was being part of a spiritual organization, especially a messianic one that has big aspirations and is going to change the world, by moving up in those organizations and becoming a representative or a teacher or an administrator or anything where you're part of the power structure. It really does feed your any delusions of grandeur you have. Who doesn't want to be saving the world?
Right.
And that's a big part of the motivation of being in there, that feeling of superiority, that we have the answers and we're really making the universe run.
I'm glad you're laughing. Yeah.
And we're going to, usher in the new age of,
Aquarius
joy
or
whatever it is. That's a very intoxicating thing.
Yeah. So, Philip, what can someone do? Let's say they were in a meditation cult, they were abused sexually, or they were taken advantage of, isolated from their family and friends, etc. They're now out. They miss meditating, but they are still kind of, it's connected to a traumatic experience.
Yeah.
What words of wisdom can you share?
Peer support is, I think, a terribly important thing. When I pulled away, and, I don't hold my experience in the TM world in the 70s to be on the level of some of the very egregious things that I've seen victims go through. But it was difficult to pull away and everything. But fortunately, it was happening in large numbers. So my closest friends, we were all sort of pulling away at the same time. And decades later, they're still my closest friends. So we could talk and we could help each other and laugh at each other and, go get therapy if we needed it or wanted it, just help each other adjust to, needing a job for the first time and whatever. So I'm extremely grateful that
Hmm.
it worked out that way for me. And I've seen it, with people from other groups as well. Having people to talk to is terribly important. And often there's value in having people who are in the same world as you,
Yes.
but there's also value in having one of the things that I learned so much just because I was a professional writer and I was researching books like American Veda. I ended up having hundreds and hundreds of conversations with people.
Hmm.
And I learned so much discovering the commonalities and differences in my set of experiences versus the people who were with, you know, Swami so and so, or,
Right.
this teacher or that teacher. It's very useful. And I'm hoping that, groups like Association for Spiritual Integrity, conferences
Hmm.
like the ones, pre-pandemic, there were, wonderful conferences like the Science and Non-Duality Conference, groups like, there were a lot of groups that bring people together. And I think it's terribly important. And the
Hmm.
work you're doing is terribly important. You probably have ways of referring people to experts to get help if they need it. I think that's one of the things we'd like to eventually be able to do at ASI, is to have resources that we can refer people to, mentors, counselors,
Hmm.
uh, mediators, and that sort of thing. It's terribly important, but because so much of it you keep to yourself,
Right.
and people are afraid to speak out. They're afraid of getting further ostracized, and in some cases, even being threatened.
Yes.
And
Exactly.
that's the more egregious kind of cultish kind of things
Yeah,
that
on the
I've seen.
influence continuum, the extreme ones, definitely, you're a non-being if you leave. You and have the right to be exterminated in some cases.
Or threatened
Yes,
and sued.
sued. I've been
Uh,
threatened to be sued more times than I could
yes, yes.
imagine.
And that's where people like you, with your expertise, and Carol Murchison, as who you pointed out, because
Hmm.
she's coming from a legal,
Yep.
uh, perf- you know, perspective. My friend Connie Zweig, you just mentioned, is coming from a psychological perspective. These are terribly important resources. A lot has been learned since the 60s and 70s. The world of transpersonal psychology was populated by a lot of people who were very interested in Eastern spirituality.
Hmm.
And they became, but they're also trained psychologists. So that world has produced a lot of good insights and a lot of reputable people.
It's definitely in progress, but I reflect back. So Yogi Bhajan, I just did an interview with a former teacher
Yeah,
from
yeah.
Belgium, but I knew about him using hypnosis and raping his female followers back in the 80s when I first.
I wish I had. I would have mentioned it in American Veda. I
Yeah,
learned
well,
about it subsequently.
but I guess the fear that I have right now, Philip, if I can state it, is that people are being pushed with this virtual reality is more real than life.
Mm.
And so it doesn't matter what happens here, it doesn't matter if the global climate falls apart because it's what we have in our helmets is more real. And it's like, no, 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 no,
That's
no, no.
scary.
Especially understanding that there are algorithms based on 5,000 data points of our personal
Yeah,
interests,
yeah.
and that they can be tweaked by authoritarians to make
That's
us,
my concern.
yeah.
The look, you and I are old enough to remember, when television was going to be this gift to mankind, but it had its downside. And
Black
now
and
it's,
white TV was my first
yes,
experience, and
right.
there was
So
3 channels plus PBS.
every technological advance, I mean, I'm better informed than
Right.
I ever was. And I like to think I'm using the media available to me wisely and with some
Hmm.
discernment. But I also know even I can be misled because it is so, the techniques of propaganda and manipulation are so sophisticated now. It's not like, you know, in the 60s when, the John Birch Society, had to give you a pamphlet or something.
Right.
They can, the crazies can get into your head, and the authoritarians can get into your people's minds very easily, and put words in people's mouths very convincingly,
Right.
and know the buttons to push.
Right.
And makes us the need for discernment and clear thinking and evidence-based reality.
Yeah, and values, knowing
Yes,
values,
yes,
like
yes,
don't do to others what you don't want done to you, like honesty,
yes.
like
Some of the old
service.
virtues, and they hold up.
Yeah, they make you feel good. Like it feels good to matter and to help others in a genuine way where you're being conscious about it and it isn't from a guilt feeling or needing to get spiritual brownie points, but just doing it because it's the right thing to do.
But when it comes to abusive spiritual leaders and teachers, they have to have their feet held to the fire
Yep.
of ethics and morality. It's if a corporate CEO or a lawyer or a doctor does something terribly unethical, not only are there enforcement procedures, but nobody expects them not to.
Right.
They're supposed to behave ethically and responsibly. Spiritual and religious leaders often get a pass.
Yes.
They're often held to be above that.
Yeah.
Or if they do, in cultish situations, when they do something that on the surface is clearly unethical, they make excuses for it.
Yeah.
In the corporate world, if somebody does something unethical to serve the bottom line, it's not acceptable.
Right.
Except, among stockholders, perhaps. But
Right.
even there, it's known to have bad consequences. Spiritual and religious teachers are often held to be above such
Yeah.
things, and that's dangerous.
Right. So you mentioned beware of any group that isolates you from your family, your friends. I was asked to throw out all my original poetry as a sign
Oh,
of my commitment to God. Like that's a big, wait a minute, why would God want me to throw out my gift
yeah,
that God gave me in the
yeah.
first place? But I had no frame of reference to say no to authority. And I'd like to take a minute just to share a resource to you. Do you know Ira Chaliff's work,
No.
Philip? He wrote 2 very important books. One's called Intelligent Disobedience, about how guide dogs for the blind are first taught to be obedient and then they're taught when to disobey their master, like not
Oh,
walking them into traffic because
fabulous.
so there's that. And then he wrote a follow-up book called Courageous Followership. And
Oh,
it's exactly what you were just talking about, where the followers need to hold the leadership accountable to the mission and they should feel free to voice, even at risk of losing their job or whatever, that they should be courageous. And he's actually teaching it in the military, which I think is
he should try the Supreme Court.
yeah, the Federalist Society is a closed system, unfortunately, with an extremist Catholic agenda. which I wrote about in The Cult of Trump. Forgive the shameless plug, but that's my last book, is about that, political cult that uses religious groups, including Scientology and Falun Gong and the Moonies and Ramtha, the channeling cult of Jay-Z Knight. So talk to us. We have a few more minutes. So one of the things I like is you quote Thich Nhat Hanh, and you also talk about some basic meditation techniques that are valuable for people to use in these crazy times.
Yeah. After 55 years of practicing meditation, I still value it. Even with everything I've learned about the imperfection of the guru that I once held to be, I never held him to be perfect, but close to it. And
you're talking about TM?
Yeah. And I still.
So what's your mantra, Philip? Can you say, or you've been programmed
honestly,
not to?
No, I will respect the privacy of those things. And I've modified it since 1968. But that piece of it, the meditation is, that's Ringo Starr, who learned, TM back in 1968. I quoted him as saying, "They can take me house, they could take me car, but they can't take me mantra." And it's like, it's a value, not the mantra as such, but the methodology. And so I'm a big believer that people should find meditative practices that work for them, that suit their personality, their lifestyle, and so forth. And that's often an individual thing. And that requires discernment, because especially now, back in the day, as you know, there were very few alternatives. If you want to learn to meditate, you didn't have that many choices. Now you can, click a mouse and have 15 different things at your disposal.
At least.
And so it requires discernment. And there are nuances. There's different between, and of course, the popular press conflates everything. So all meditation is the same. Mindfulness, meditation, interchangeable terms, but they're not. They're different practices, and there's different methods. The world of contemplative and meditative practices is very old, very diverse. Even in India, just within Buddhism, just within what we think of as Hinduism, just in the yoga world, there's so many different forms. So people should be careful and discerning and find qualified teachers to learn from, and not just pick something up in a self-help magazine, and choose what works, and choose where there's evidence, where you have a friend who has practiced it and learned it with a reputable teacher who seems to have at least some connection to a reputable lineage, as opposed to something he just made up.
Well,
depending on the lineage.
Concerning about Maharishi, I do want to just state categorically that the former members have taught me about the mantra fraud, where they were giving the same
Why do
mantra.
they think it's a fraud? Oh, yeah.
Because
why is that?
What year you were initiated, and it's the same thing, but you're told that it's unique to you.
No, that's an interesting thing, Steve. Because back in the day, the way it was presented, people thought that there was a mantra for every human being, different from another. It was never the case, and most of the responsible teachers would never have made that claim. There were categories of, having to do with age. And so a lot of people have, of course, the same mantra. There's only a finite number of them.
But when I asked
the impression
people,
was given.
No, the impression was given,
yes,
and I think it was kind of a deception from my, frame. But a lot of there are studies that show mantric meditation isn't for everyone, and if people were having adverse reactions to repeating the mantra, they were told do more because they were unstressing, and that was causing very serious things. I like to meditate to my breath. That's what works best for me. You mentioned that in the book. But
Hmm.
I guess for me, I am a little bit more strident about if I know a guru who claims to be celibate is screwing a young female but is holding his disciples accountable. I can't follow that person and
No,
respect them.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
But there's a difference between following the person and doing something they recommend that may have value.
I have very negative feelings about
Because
TM. So
you
forgive
obviously
me,
do. No,
but
you
it's okay.
obviously do. You had a set of experiences that lead you
I was
to that
never in it.
conclusion.
I
No,
just,
but
there are too
you
many people that I've worked with who were harmed by it, and especially children, and right now in MIU. And I don't like David Lynch spending so much money trying to promote it, or bringing Paul
well,
McCartney and Ringo back into TM, even though they distanced for
now
so many years.
these are grown people who have their own sense of discernment, so they obviously have
I
found value in it.
I would ask them to watch David Wants to Fly documentary
You
and
know
learn
what,
about the
Steve?
bite
I'd be
model.
shocked if they didn't.
I would be shocked if they did and
And
still
you
want
know
to
what?
affiliate.
In my experience, they may say, "Well, that's too bad, but I still value my meditation. It works." That's
So
certainly how I
so I'll
feel.
come back to Herb Benson, who said you don't need that mantra. You can pick any word and use it, and it
And
has the same effect.
there's really very little evidence for that, Steve, if you look into it. There are studies that show there are differences
Oh,
which depending
another
on which
conversation then,
yeah,
because I'm open
yeah,
to
yeah. I think
learning new perspectives on things for
yeah,
sure.
yeah.
But I also want to say that it's never okay in my book for a teacher to have sex with a
I
disciple, a
couldn't agree more.
therapist to have sex with their patient. It's just not, the power differential is too great,
Yeah,
and
definitely.
it's just not okay. Even if the leader says it's not sex, I'm doing this to heal you. Open your legs in the stirrups and meditate, and it will,
And you'll be blessed.
yeah, and you'll be blessed. It's just sad
It
that so
is.
many
It's very
people,
sad, and the revelations keep coming.
yeah,
In some cases, revelations of things that happened 50, 60 years ago that we didn't know about.
yeah,
And it is upsetting. It's terribly upsetting and disturbing. And, we have to face it and not shy away from it and deal with it in a honest and open way.
yep. Well
That's what we're
said.
trying to do.
Well said. That's exactly. I'm so glad to meet you, and I want to circle back to life is precious. Humans are precious. We need to take care of one another. We need to take care of our planet in a responsible way. And we have an obligation to uplift people's consciousness, to evolve to greater states of awareness, and reject, in my opinion, now I'm preaching this, flagrant consumerism. I need, to be an influencer on TikTok and have 1 million followers to be a valuable person on earth. It's like, no, you don't. You don't need, have a few close friends, you know, have meaningful work and life, and, that you're contributing, it's real.
And there's many ways of doing that. The book you held up before, Spiritual Practice for Crazy Times, my last chapter talks about the importance of first taking care of yourself, but not leaving it there.
Right.
we all need, as you said, to raise our awareness to live fulfilling lives. But then we are citizens as well
Right.
as individuals, and we have responsibility for one another. It's
Right.
terribly important. And the funny thing about that is all the studies, as you probably know, show that when you do perform service to others, you're the first beneficiary.
It's very true. It's very true.
Yeah.
People ask me, how can you keep doing this for 47 years? Isn't it hard? And I say, it's hard, but it's so fulfilling that it's reinforcing to know that I have something unique to help another human being to, get their power back, to get their self back, and to realize that it was what they were influenced by was the problem and not them inherently, and to reconnect them with family and friends and their heart work is very fulfilling. So Philip
Indeed.
Goldberg, thank you. Your
Thank you,
website is
Steve.
philipgoldberg.com. You serve on the board of the Association for Spiritual Integrity. Check out Philip's books, and we'll be in touch. And
Okay, spiritual, the ASI is spiritual-integrity.org.
Right. And the way it works here is we will do a transcript of what we just talked about. We'll write a blog. We'll send you a draft, and you can add all the links that you
And
like.
look for Steve on my Spirit Matters
Yes,
podcast.
we'll put a link to that too. Thank you so
Okay.
much, Philip
Thanks,
Goldberg.
Steve. It's a
Take
pleasure.
care.
Keep
Bye.
up the good work.
And you too.
Bye.
Steve Hassan here. It's been decades since my family rescued me from the Moonies. I've been at this for over 47 years. The need has never been greater. If you're able, please consider hitting the Super Thanks button below, and it'll help us to do better. Every penny will help us toward our goal of educating the planet about undue influence. Remember, it's your mind. Only you should control it.